Thank you very much, Mr. Commissioner. Just before commencing with my continuation, if I may just speak personally for a moment in the loss of our colleague, Don Brenner. You, of course, Mr. Commissioner, knew him in the capacity of Chief Justice of the Bench. In my case, I knew him as a counsel. I did a number of aviation cases, of which he was always on the defense side, from the PWA crash to the Air Rainbow crash in Nanaimo. He was a formidable foe in every case that I had against him, and I know that the bar suffers a tremendous loss with his passing over the weekend, and I just thought I'd put that on record. Thank you. Having said that, I would like to continue my cross-examination of this panel. I have limited time, and I will do my best to get through this as quickly as possible. Firstly, focusing still on you, Mr. Nilets, you and I had an exchange on Friday, and I had suggested to you that you consult with your colleagues who had more of a grasp or specialty within lake habitat work. Did you have an opportunity to do that? And if you did, are you able to answer my questions as posed to you on Friday, that it would have been advisable, if the terms of reference permitted it, to provide this commission with habitat analysis in your report as it related to recreational activities in some of the CUs?
Yes, I did consult with others on my team, and in our determination, we don't believe that it's a significant gap at the terms of reference, that it's not included. So we essentially went through our questions of Stuart Outen in our report in terms of looking at the plausibility of the mechanisms of effect and the spatial overlap of the existing nursery lakes and recreational activities, also considering temporal trends in juvenile productivity across those lakes where we have data, and given those combination of factors, came to the determination that it's very unlikely that recreational activities are important in contributing to the declines, and so therefore don't believe it's a significant gap in the terms of reference.
And in giving that reply, you are focused in part on the Cultus Lake CU, are you?
We're talking about the Fraser aggregate.
And you're only talking about the Fraser aggregate. I'll come to that in a moment. I'd like to ask Mr. Lunn to put before us the transcript of last day, which is March the 10th. At page 45, you had an exchange with Mr. Timberg, and I'm wondering how your reply today jives with what you said in response to Mr. Timberg. At page 45, which Mr. Lunn will have before us in a moment, I apologize, I didn't give him notice in advance. And if we go down to line 29, you're talking at this point about the intermediate stressors, of which I think Mr. Timberg identified habitat analysis as one of those stressors. You said at line 29, all right, and if, a question I should say, Mr. Timberg said, all right, and if you had considered these intermediate measures that we just spoke about, or these other habitat indicators, would that have affected your outcome, your response? My suspicion is no. Without having those data and having a better sense of those measures, it's hard for me to conclusively say whether it would have or not. Now, I suggest to you, if I interpret that response correctly, that's not very comforting to me, and I would assume to the Commission, if indeed you, as a specialist in habitat work, are saying you are uncertain as to whether such an analysis of the intermediate measures might be consequential to this Commission. Your response?
I think there's some confusion here in terms of the term intermediate measures. So in the context of what's being presented here in my testimony, I was considering the intermediate measures in terms of habitat variables, so habitat condition, water temperature, gravel quality, things like that. The way that I'm understanding the way that you're talking about recreational activities as intermediate stresses. So there's stresses on those habitats. So that's kind of one step removed from impacts on those habitat conditions. So in this context, I was talking about the habitat variables themselves, not the stressors.
I see. Well, that'll take time for us to analyze that response of yours and to make sense of it at the end of the day in terms of our final submission. I'd like to move on.
All I'm saying is I think it's what I'm saying today is still consistent with those statements that I made earlier.
Thank you. Because of time limitation, I want to move on in the context of your approach to this report number 3. You repeatedly said to us in response to questions on Thursday of how you had been mandated to deal with this analysis on an aggregate basis and not on a CU basis. Now, I have reviewed the statement of work, Appendix D to your report, and if Mr. Lunn would be good enough to put it up, although I'm only going to refer to one paragraph there. Frankly, I don't see where your terms of reference limited you to an aggregate analysis of the habitat issues. And so, firstly, would you be kind enough to inform us where that is dictated in the terms of reference? And for your assistance, once Mr. Lunn has it up, it's an appendix to the report as filed. So Exhibit 562, and at 562 the terms of reference is, I believe, Appendix D. Do I have that correctly, Mr. Nalitz?
Sorry, repeat that last part.
I just want to give instructions to, here we go, Mr.
I have it on page 130 and 131 of the report.
Yes, thank you. And if you would go to paragraph 3.3, scope of work, under scope of work, it reads, once the status of the CUs and substocks within CUs has been determined, then hypotheses will be developed to explain the trends and status of the CUs, focusing on industrial and urban stressors pertaining to the freshwater part of the salmon's life cycle, as well as fishing pressure. Now, again, I'm not a scientist, but from my reading of that, it specifically instructed you to do an analysis, not possibly on an aggregate basis too, but also on a CU basis. Do you disagree with me?
I would say that both of our interpretations of that section would be acceptable. The hypotheses that we used, or we developed to explain the trends and status, have to look across CUs. So individual CUs are a part of looking at that pattern. But we don't look at a specific CU and try to determine the cause-effect linkages and explain what's happening in an individual CU. It requires much different data, a lot more data-intensive data gathering and analysis, and that wasn't part of what we were looking at.
Well, when you say that wasn't part of, where do you point to in the terms of reference to suggest that you were ordered to limit this analysis to an aggregate basis?
It's based, from our point of view, it was based on what is going to provide us insights into understanding the declines of the aggregate. And so if we have limited data on productivity we have limited data on productivity across the CUs. So we could, in the first place, we could not have done it across all the CUs individually.
But might you have done it in respect to some CUs that were deemed to be critical in terms of abundance issues?
Given the scope of what we had to do and the number of things that we had to address, I don't think it was possible, and also would not have helped us provide insights into the aggregate situation.
Yes, and I don't want to appear to be critical to you, sir, but do I hear you to say that it was your decision to approach this on an aggregate basis as opposed to being directed to do so in the terms of reference?
I'd say, I can't recall specific conversations, but I'd say we certainly talked about our analysis with the Commission in terms of how we were scoping it and planning it out, and it was deemed acceptable in those conversations.
I want you to appreciate where I'm coming from, and I want to refer to testimony given at this inquiry. And Mr. Lunn, if you would be good enough to pull up transcript of December the 3rd of last year, page 21. This is testimony of Dr. Hyatt. I assume you know who he is.
I do.
Dr. Hyatt, speaking at this inquiry at line 26, said, well, let me start with the notion of why Strategy 3, speaking obviously of the WSP, Strategy 3 may be germane to this inquiry. The inquiry was stimulated in part by a dramatic event that occurred for one conservation unit of sockeye in the Fraser River, principally the run of the Chilko sockeye, which in the 2009 return year showed a dramatic deviation from expected return. And then it goes on from there. The point I want to make with you, sir, is do you not agree that it would be in the interest of this inquiry that there be a habitat analysis conducted in respect to some or certain CUs that have been earmarked by the scientists as being of concern and maybe explaining the 2009 situation?
Mr. Commissioner, that's not a proper question for this witness. This witness is not here to opine on what the scope of this inquiry is or what evidence should be called before this inquiry.
Indeed, not to inform the Commission of what should be the scope of the inquiry, but I'm asking you as a habitat specialist whether it would be advisable for the Commission to possibly request some further research, be it by your firm or wherever, that would focus on certain CUs and habitat stressors.
Again, he's asking the witness to define what work the Commission should be doing, and that's not appropriate for this witness to do.
Well, let me spin it a different way. Do you believe it would be beneficial, being a habitat specialist, to have some analysis done of the on an individual CU basis, at least in respect to certain priorized CUs?
If I can ask a question of you, for what purpose?
For the purpose of trying to explain the issues of abundance or lack thereof in 2007, 2008, 2009, which was the very purpose of this inquiry.
Yes.
Your answer is yes?
Yes.
Thank you. If I may go on, you one of the themes of your report number 3 is a deficiency in data, and as I read it, and correct me if I'm wrong, deficiency of data for your purposes in doing your analysis in both habitat and stock enumeration. You would agree with that?
Yes, that's correct.
Yes. Now, would you further agree with me that that deficiency of data makes it very difficult to apply and implement the WSP and to make harvest management decisions in the absence of that kind of data?
Well, I guess for one, I want to say that I don't think it's appropriate for me to comment on the data weaknesses in terms of harvest management. That's not within the scope of what we were looking at with our report, and don't feel that that's appropriate to comment on that. In terms of your question about those weaknesses and how they might affect implementation of strategies 2 and 3 related to habitat and ecosystem indicators, I think that those weaknesses do make it difficult to implement those strategies, and I think DFO is working on trying to address some of those weaknesses.
I'm sorry. Yes. And in fact, you say you don't want to make comment about, but didn't you precisely make comment about it in report number 3, which is exhibit 562, Mr. Lunn, under your recommendations at page 59, the bottom 3 lines of page 59, bottom 3 lines, going on then to the next page. To improve our understanding about population status across CU, scientists need more information about the abundance and distribution of small lake and all river CUs, though we recognize that filling this gap may be impractical for river CUs. Existing programs for monitoring fry, and adults are essential to understanding status, but historically resources have been dedicated to large lake conservation units. This emphasis is inconsistent with the wild salmon policy, which places importance on protecting diversity of populations. Ensuring conservation of small CUs could have dramatic effect on harvest policies and in-season management. So you are, unquote, so you are connecting the deficiency in the database as having implication in terms of implementing the wild salmon policy.
Yes.
All right.
In terms of how it, I'm not suggesting one direction or the other, how it might affect fisheries in general, but just saying that there are linkages, yes. There are implications.
Linkages that could affect, using your very words, have dramatic effects on harvest policies and in-season management.
Yes.
Meaning it could lead to a closure of a fishery that should otherwise or would not otherwise have been closed if there had been proper data, right?
We didn't say that in the report, so I wouldn't want to say that here. What the appropriate management actions are to take.
Well, we'll deal with the interpretation of your paragraph at a later period of this inquiry. But that leads to a focus on the recommendations that you made in your report. And in an exchange with Mr. Timberg, you were asked by him as to the costing of the implementation of those recommendations. And I believe you said, nobody faults you for this, you didn't really have any idea what those costs would be, correct?
That's correct.
All right. Now, you may or may not be aware that wild salmon policy dictates that there is not to be any additional funding for the implementation of WSP. Are you familiar with that?
Anecdotally, I've heard from others that,
Right.
that those are some of the constraints that have been put on implementation of wild salmon policy.
If I had more time, I'd go into it by citing it, but assuming for a moment that I speak accurately to you in respect to the policy. Assuming there is no funding specifically for the implementation of WSP, would you agree with me it's obviously highly unlikely that your recommendations could possibly be implemented?
Yes, I think that's unlikely in the current environment for funding and support for wild salmon policy.
And appreciating that fact, would you also join me in agreeing that to continue to pursue the implementation of WSP without the carrying out of recommendations such as yours is terribly prejudicial to the resource and its management?
Can you repeat that question?
Yes, I may not frame it exactly the same way the second time. Would you not agree with me that if your recommendations and others that are being brought forward cannot be funded because of the policy of the WSP that everything is to be done within the existing financial envelope, that situation leads to a serious consequence in the management and harvest of the resource?
I feel that's a tough, in terms of serious consequence. I find it hard to assess what that consequence might be. So it's hard for me to imagine that on the spot here. So I'm not sure if that's answering your question.
But you appear to be a strong advocate for the implementation of your recommendations, of course.
I'm an advocate if I'm putting pieces together here that I see being presented. So I see a wild salmon policy which has certain goals and objectives in terms of what they're trying to achieve, and we have a situation with the decline of Fraser sockeye salmon. And so we're trying to frame our recommendations in the context of the decline, recognizing that there's set goals and objectives through the wild salmon policy to address some of those things. I'm not saying that those are our goals and objectives, that's what we should be doing. I'm not saying that I advocate for the wild salmon policy. That's others who have put that policy forward.
But
I'm just recognizing the situation in the Fraser and the opportunities that are there to address some of those concerns.
But you've made a series of recommendations, which is precisely what you were paid to do, and you brought your expertise to that task. The fact is that by failing to pursue the recommendations as you propose them, there are obviously consequences, aren't there?
Yes.
and the consequences relate to the overall harvest management and to the good health of the resource.
Among other things, yes.
Yes. You say in your report, and I could refer you to it, that it relates to peer review, and I'm just going to give you a quick quote. If you want to see it in your report, I'm happy to cite it. It's at page 6. You say in part at page 6, however, it should be noted that the delineation of the CU boundaries put forward by DFO have not been subject to the peer review process in the traditional sense of the term. It is our understanding that CU delineation will be independently evaluated in the near future. This might be Ms. Wachakowski. Sorry, the pronunciation of your name?
Wachowski.
Sorry, I should know better. I don't know which of you wishes to answer this. I'm surprised that there wasn't a peer review. Does that surprise you? And do you believe it is absolutely essential that there be a peer review of that area of work by DFO?
Just to clarify, there was a peer review within DFO of the CUs, and that is ongoing. That's an iterative process. What this speaks to, and this is based on our understanding from feedback from the reviewers of our work here, is that there has not yet been, but is in the process of coming, a review of the CUs by people outside of DFO. So that's what is implied by independent review.
I see. Thank you, I understand. Lastly, there is reference in your report to a sentence that I was intrigued by, and I would ask for your interpretation. In your report, Project 3, at page 12, and I'm taking all these questions out of context because I don't have the time to frame the question in context, but if you have any problems with it, tell me. Bottom line, under Habitat 2.2, you say, being highly specialized, there has been suggestions that lake-type sockeye salmon populations could be considered evolutionary dead ends. And then you cite from Woods in '95 and 2007, and Wood et al. In 2008. That sentence intrigued me. Can you explain what that sentence means?
I think the points here were raised. So let me say first, though, that this is there's some debate around this. I wouldn't say that there's conclusive beliefs in either direction, but the statements here are comparing the river type CUs and the lake type CUs. River type CUs, the characteristics the life history characteristics tend to be more plastic, more variable in terms of where they're spawning, the habitat types that they're using, whereas lake CUs are much more fixed in terms of the specific locations that they use and habitats that they use. And so there's some debate and discussion that given the flexibility and the plasticity of the river type CUs compared to lake CUs, that the river types might be more resilient to disturbances, given that they're able to move locations if a certain location is stressed or disturbed relative to lake CUs.
But I don't see your sentence as simply being a comparative analysis. I see you saying that in respect to lake sockeye CUs, that in an evolutionary perspective, there can be dead ends. And I wanted to understand what that means, dead ends.
So I believe what is being, so I was not the lead on this, but I certainly understand what was written here, or certainly am aware of what the author wrote here. In an evolutionary sense, the lakes can pose, if a lake is disturbed and that component of the population is removed, there aren't opportunities for that CU. There aren't opportunities for that CU to then move to another location. Say, for example, they don't have that ability. They don't have as much of an ability to move from that location to another location to ensure that that population persists. Whereas if you look at the statement or the sentence immediately prior to that, it talks about river type CUs that is more generalized in their habitat requirements, meaning that they have that flexibility. So given some disturbance event, say a slide, or for example, or some kind of major perturbation of the habitats, river CUs evolutionarily more adaptable, more able to move locations, whereas lake CUs don't have that same kind of flexibility and plasticity. That's the discussion that's referred to in these few sentences.
Do I read into your response that that school of opinion would believe that with certain lake CUs, no matter what remedial steps are taken, it is a dead end?
A dead end?
Meaning that no matter what remedial steps are taken, it is unlikely to resuscitate the stock.
I don't interpret it that way.
You don't?
And an evolutionary timescale is what we're talking about, much longer timescale than
well, rather than taking up
resuscitating
more
the stock in terms of looking shorter-term declines of across a couple decades.
Well, rather than taking up more time of the inquiry, you cite these two Woods studies. I don't know if they are already somewhere in Ringtail. If they're not, could I ask you to inform your council, Commission Council, of these studies so that council can provide us with the citations or wherever we might find these studies that speak to this very issue, all right?
Certainly.
Thank you. I have no further questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next questioner is Mr. Prowse for the province.
Yes, Mr. Commissioner, D.C. Prowse for the province. I think I'll ask a couple of follow-up questions from what my friend Mr. Rosenblum has just asked. So one is on the wild salmon policy and your recommendations, and we've had recommendations from you and also from the last report last week with different projects, if I can call it that, or for research or other things, often involving outside resources, some of which are in the millions of tens of millions of dollars. So my question is, if the federal government were willing to invest money in additional research beyond what's being done now, would you have a recommendation as to whether some of that money should be used for internal DFO work on the wild salmon policy projects as opposed to outside work of other kinds of research?
I just want to be clear that our recommendations relate to filling some of the gaps in the science to help us have a better understanding of some of the causes of the decline and discriminating about across the different life stages and how the impacts on those life stages might be contributing to those declines. So to make judgment calls around whether to fill those gaps, it's more appropriate to do that by funding certain components of the wild salmon policy or to fund independent research projects. I feel it's a bit of a value judgment in terms of how to allocate between those two options. My suspicion is that it would be a combination of both, that there are the mechanisms within the wild salmon policy that I think they're there to address some of the issues that we've brought up in our recommendations, and likewise I think there's some of the things can be dealt with through independent research or independent studies. So I think it's a bit too much to say kind of on the spot, like what's the proper balance across those.
Thank you. And I guess a related question has to do with whether, as a result of the work that Ms. Wachowski did, is it Dr. Wachowski? Caught now in appellations. the Wachowski work. Whether there's an implication that there may be more cost-effective ways of doing some of that work rather than the science approach that's been embodied in the work that DFO itself has done. Is that an implication of a possibility or an option that could be explored?
I think what you're making reference to is a particular part of the work I did where it's referring to the work of Dr. Holt in relation to diversity metrics, where they don't have metrics that speak specifically to measuring genetic diversity, but rather are looking to capture diversity indirectly by looking at distribution of salmon and the difference of habitat types that they use for various purposes. And so I think that those efficiencies are something I think that are worth exploring in if there is a finite budget or finite resources available where it's possible to have surrogate indicators or metrics that speak to other things that might be more, such as gathering genetic samples, which is very costly. There are other ways to perhaps capture that are equally defensible. I'm not here to comment on what those may be, and I think DFO's in a better place to comment on that based on their expertise.
And Mr. Commissioner, if Mr. Lund, could you please bring up Exhibit 573? I want to refer to the Selby information that's, it may be, on my copy, I had a reference at pages 67. Does that make sense? So Selby is Session D, Item 12? Yes. Thank you.
That's what you're looking for?
Yes, thank you. Yes, so in the in your report, you have referenced your work on Selby paper, and as first of all, who are the researchers? If we can just turn back to the beginning of that section. I'm sorry, it'd be 2 pages before the chart which you brought up. Yes, so are you familiar with what their expertise is and where they work?
Many of them, yes.
And can you tell us what they are? Just give us a quick overview.
Mike Bradford, research scientist, focused on habitats for salmon across BC. Maren Haig, a modeler and research support for other researchers at DFO. Erlen McIsaac was my supervisor for my master's. Again, a habitat, sockeye habitat researcher looking at stressors such as forestry. Dave Patterson, dealing with water temperatures in the main stem Fraser and migration of sockeye.
And Daniel Selby?
I haven't met Daniel, so I don't know him, and I know another person on our team spoke with Daniel as part of our work, but I can't really speak to a lot of what he does.
All right, and are all these authors with DFO?
As far as I know, yes.
All right. And so you, in your report, summarize their findings and basically accept their findings and then go beyond them in terms of having better data and doing further analysis. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And you explained that you thought it was important for you to recognize that work going forward.
Absolutely.
So turning then to the table that's 2 pages in, Figure 1, tells us that an absence of link between land use and population trends is not unexpected. So that was the key conclusion they came to, that they came to. Is that right?
There is a latter part of this section, this report, that I think better characterizes some of their conclusions in terms of it's unlikely that freshwater influences are explaining the declines, but this certainly summarizes this piece of that work.
All right. And the reference to the next sentence says sockeye salmon are likely less vulnerable to such habitat changes compared to coho salmon because sockeye often spawn in lake buffered streams. And compensatory and variable mortality in the lake may mask spawning ground impacts. So I guess there's two parts of that sentence. You've referred in your report to the lake buffered streams. It does say lake buffered streams. So can you explain the importance of the lake buffering and the lake buffered streams?
Certainly. So this is a big piece of our work in that when we assessed impacts on spawning habitats, we discriminated between two general locations of spawning. So we identified those locations that were downstream of lakes because of this issue that lakes can buffer upstream disturbances. And then we also identified locations that were spawning tributary to lakes or other tributary rivers. So it's the idea that lakes, if there's a disturbance in a headwater upstream of a lake, that whether it's sediment, whether there are temperature impacts or flow impacts, given the large volumes of these lakes, that if sediment comes in, that it'll settle out before being passed through the lake outlet. Similarly, temperatures, if there's heating effects that come into a lake, that given the large surface areas of lakes and the exposure to climate, that those factors are going to overwhelm any kinds of disturbance that might have occurred due to disturbance upstream. So it's recognizing that lakes can have a buffering capacity, or a buffer against upstream impacts. But certainly I'd say that we went one step further than what Selby did, and we quantitatively discriminated between those lake buffered streams and the tributary ones, whereas they just did a yes/no categorization. And ours was at a much finer scale than that.
And can you explain that? Can you just amplify what you just said? In what respects was yours then at a much finer scale?
So
and how does that?
They essentially looked at is the CU or the stock lake buffered or not. So it's kind of a yes or no, a binary discrimination, whereas we looked at a continuum from 0 to 1. So fully lake buffered being a 1, 0 lake buffering on the spawning habitats being 0. And so we had the full continuum represented.
All right, and your conclusion nonetheless was that there wasn't a variable impact that in each case?
So this was not important in helping us, so this variable was not important in helping us understand the patterns of the decline across the CUs.
All right, so it didn't get to the population type
That's
level.
correct.
And the next sentence talks about, moreover, lakes with larger dilution volumes and more varied habitat may further buffer sockeye from land use impacts during rearing relative to streams. I'm not sure whether you've covered that in your last answers or not.
I think it's related. So the sentence before was talking about spawning habitats, so spawning downstream of lakes. This is talking about rearing juveniles within lakes. So similarly, there will be some buffering of some of the upstream impacts, though certainly that the potential for an effect is greater there than on the downstream spawning.
Below figure 6, Mr. Lunn, is the heading conclusions. Is this the paragraph that you were referring to earlier?
Yes.
The phraseology they've used is that we're unable to find any quantitative evidence to support the hypothesis that the declines in the productivity of Fraser sockeye salmon were related to changes in freshwater habitat conditions in the natal and nursery environments. So that goes to your main point. Is that correct?
Yes.
And the language there, I think you found, why do you find the language there preferable from your point of view? What helps us from that use of language as opposed to what they were saying earlier? Or
well, I guess my impression was that they were talking about the relative likelihood in terms of that it being unlikely. I don't see reference to a level of likelihood here. So that's why I just prefer it. I prefer it to be in terms of a relative likelihood, because in terms of testing for cause and effect in science in general, we can't say with certainty if there's no effect. We can say in terms of the relative likelihood that it's unlikely. So that's why it's my preference to say that versus a conclusive or definitive statements.
And they refer to their analyses being preliminary, and you've told us of one difference of approach that you took that went beyond what they did. Are there others that are significant changes where you went beyond what they had done?
Well, I think we, as you just said, we went further in terms of identifying specific spawning locations. We also went further in delineating the land areas that have the potential to influence those habitats, those in-river habitats. So we were, whereas they used a kind of downstream point of interest and looked at a very large-scale area, we were much more refined in looking at local habitat uses in local areas of disturbance. I'd say and they also used some very generic data sources on disturbance, and we used some more root data sources on some of the disturbances and stressors.
My friend, Ms. Baker, took you, I think, through the summary highlights and got you to explain them in your own words, and I'm not going to try to improve on that. And in particular, I'm not going to try to get you to explain the statistical theories and details. I'll leave that to others braver than me. But I would ask you to turn to tables 20 to 22, and those, Mr. Lunn, are at page 562 of the report. Sorry, at page 111, I believe, of the report, which is Exhibit 562. This table, I think some of it is summarized and discussed around sections 4.1 and 4.2 of your report, these tables, and that lead to table 19.
4.3, I think, is the specific section we referenced them, but yes, in section 4.
And the prose that we see here, I take it as a result of the analysis that I assume was done by computer and other analytical methods. Is that how this works?
So, yes, it is. The analysis is the result of some analysis of spatial data, but what's contained in this table is also a summary of the state of the science and what we understand about cause-effect linkages between stressors and habitat changes and potential for impacts on populations. So it's a combination of both of those.
All right, and so again, the analysis is to go through something that may be recognized in the literature and elsewhere as having either effects, has affected other species, or has affected sockeye, or whatever the case may be, and then in most cases you then end up with your quantitative analysis that leads to the general conclusions that are in table 19 and in your report that you've already expressed.
Yes.
And so dealing with table 20, forest harvesting is the first subject you deal with, and it's something, as you say, that there are a variety of plausible mechanisms And this is a study that has been studied, and that is the subject of regulation by DFO and by others. Is that right?
Yes.
And the conclusion in 7 is that contrasting conditions do exist among CUs, but a multiple regression analysis does not support the hypothesis that forest harvesting has had a significant impact on Fraser River sockeye salmon population parameters. So that is a statement of your conclusion with respect to this important variable, and again, the emphasis in part is on the word population, right?
Yes, that's correct.
And with respect to the mountain pine beetle, your report shows pretty dramatic incursion of the mountain pine beetle. For those of us living in the Lower Mainland who may not see it and experience it on a daily basis, is that right? And over time.
Yes, certainly in terms of the proportion of land areas that have the potential to influence sockeye habitats. In some cases, the level of disturbance was quite high. And it's a relatively recent phenomena, kind of mid-2000s.
Right, and so part of the issue here is that because the effects are recent, they haven't, well, not in part perhaps because the effects are recent. When you're looking back over a 20-year decline that you're trying to explain, the more recent effects haven't had any quantitative results yet.
In terms of an assessment of the data, essentially looking at the trend in the decline and the pattern of increase in mountain pine beetle, they don't coincide. The timing of those things don't coincide. Correct.
All right. And then roads is a third topic that you deal with, and again, there are well-recognized mechanisms by which roads and road density can impact fish habitat. Is that correct?
That's correct.
But again, the conclusion on page 112 under item 7 is that contrasting conditions do exist among CUs, but a multiple regression analysis does not support the hypothesis that road density has had a significant impact on Fraser sockeye salmon population parameters. So that was your conclusion. Again, the emphasis on the word population.
Yes.
And then turning to table 21, with respect to agriculture, on the strength of the effect at item 2, so that's on page 113, it says the strength of the impact is expected to be generally low for all habitat types. Although agriculture and urbanization has the potential to strongly affect spawning streams, none of the watersheds have high levels of these land uses. Maybe you could explain that to me. Are we really saying that most of the CUs we're looking at are in the upper Fraser? Is that why?
Well, the CUs range from CUs that are in the Lower Mainland to the headwaters of the Fraser. If you want me to explain these statements, I think the first sentence is just a generalization about across all habitat types, the nursery spawning migration, that it's relative to other stressors generally considered low,
Okay.
as impacts across those habitat types and CUs. However, if there is the potential for a strong link, our belief is that it's most likely to be realized on the spawning habitats, which is what the second sentence is referring to. But again, that as we've through our assessment on those spawning habitats, the level of stress is relatively low.
All right. So when you look, actually, so you do the CU analysis, and when you look at the CUs, which you're trying to get contrasts out of, it for most of the CUs, it's relatively low compared to other stressors.
Yes.
I think I'll ask you to just carry on in item 2. So you refer to mitigation measures on some land holdings. Can you explain what that might mean or did mean?
Also, I believe, well, certainly I'm aware of certain kinds of riparian restoration, for example, which can help stabilize banks and some agricultural locations. So things like that, which can help mitigate the impacts of those land uses on sockeye spawning.
All right, and then the last sentence says migration corridors are bordered by extensive urban and agricultural land use, but these appear to have little impact on migration activities. So can you explain that?
Well, it's partly referring to the mechanisms of effect given what we're looking at. So our belief is that migration corridors tend to be larger rivers, Fraser, say Quesnel, Chilco, things like that. And so the larger the river, the less likely it is that a physical disturbance in a riparian zone is going to either block passage, say for example, or increase temperatures significantly relative to other factors that are influencing those migration corridors.
With respect to water use, again, the conclusion at item 7 on page 114 is that there are contrasting conditions, but the multiple regression analysis does not support the hypothesis that high levels of water use have had a significant impact on Fraser sockeye salmon population parameters. Water use varies substantially among CUs, but declines in sockeye salmon abundance have occurred in both high and low water use areas. So, because you don't get that differentiation, then you conclude that it's not having a differential impact at the population level.
Yes, that's correct.
With respect to mines, so at 113 item 2, basically there are well-recognized hazards of mines, but the expectation and the strength of the estimated effect is generally weak because there's a low level of activity, and secondly because there are prohibitions under the Fisheries Act which are acceded to. Is that a fair summary of that point?
Yes.
All right, and then table 22 continues the analysis for small hydro, large hydro, and log storage. And on the small hydro, basically you don't, item 7 says not applicable, and I gather that's because, as stated in items 1 and 2, there are no or very few operational IPPs that have impacted thus far.
That's correct.
And with respect to large hydro, which again is well recognized and I think has historically been a problem, your conclusion really is at item 5 that the Bridge, Seton, and Chaco projects have both been in operation since the 1950s. Both have had known historical impacts on migrating sockeye salmon, direct mortality of smolts and adults at Bridge Seton, and thermal stress on adults at Chaco. For both projects, mitigation measures have been enacted with apparent success, so survival should have improved in recent years relative to historical conditions. So that sort of summarizes the situation there.
Yes.
And for log storage, the item 4 tells us that there could be impacts both on out-migrating smolts and migrating adults. The weakness of the expected response, declines in marine survival of sockeye salmon are not likely to be the result of log storage activity.
That's correct.
So, I wanted to very briefly ask a question. You've been both qualified as experts in structured decision-making, and I'm aware that you've both done work effect on the wild salmon policy for, I think, the David Suzuki Foundation, which is a published report that I think is referred to in your footnotes. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
The Commission has heard quite a bit of evidence now about collaboration and integration and cooperation for such things as watershed planning. Is this something that your experience suggests is important? This is collaboration amongst people who in effect are participants here, different governments, First Nations, people with a stake in the industry.
I think it's important when there's a resource that is affected by the decisions of many different agencies. So the decisions or actions that those agencies take have impacts on a common resource. So when you're having situations like that, it certainly, in our view, can improve the situation. You can identify efficiencies and areas of overlap and try to reduce redundancies and things like that, and share information and ensure that there's a stronger link between the actions that agencies are taking and the consequences of those actions on the resource.
So there's been a little bit of evidence before the Commission about the Integrated Salmon Dialogue Forum, which is, I think, referenced in one of your earlier reports, and that is in the process of sunsetting, and in fact on April 18th and 19th, I believe they're having, in effect, a wrap-up and legacy session, what they call widening the circle. Are you familiar with the ISDF, either of you?
I'm familiar with it in our report. I can't speak to the details of it. Do you remember?
Are those the forums that are organized by Simon Fraser University, where they're the facilitators?
Yeah, Glenn Sigurdsson and Barry Stewart.
I'm familiar with them and have attended several of them.
And are there, in your view, ideas about how they might serve as a model for collaboration going forward, the legacies from some of those sessions you've attended?
Having only attended as a observer and not as someone who's involved in setting the agenda and the discussions and the panels and the topics that are discussed in those forums, I can't really comment on how that has worked as a model.
I think I exhausted my time. I noted that you were involved in, I believe, San Diego, which looked like it was possibly a collaborative process, but not clear to me whether it was or wasn't. If it was, are there any lessons from that you would share with us?
Can you clarify? I'm not sure what you're referencing.
I thought you were involved in a project in San Diego which looked like a multi-stakeholder process to deal with.
I think it's Sacramento.
It's like Sacramento?
Yeah,
Somewhere in California.
Yeah.
Are there lessons that, in terms of collaboration from that process, that you could share with us?
Yeah, I think the primary lesson, and I'm not the lead of that work, and so I can only speak based on my involvement, but in terms of the progress that was made developing the decision support tools for the Sacramento River, the greatest steps forward involved the Department of Water Resources working with and setting are putting forward their management objectives and what they were trying to accomplish within their institutions, and bringing those into our work, which was for a different client. And so it was working with both parties that it was able to move forward and made it more useful.
Thank you.
If I can add to that point, I think a similar related model in BC to some of the things that we've been working on in Sacramento, and by we I mean ESSA, is related to the BC Hydro Water Use Planning process in terms of developing tools to inform decisions and having multiple audiences and organizations involved in setting the objectives and assessing the consequences of different decisions and alternatives. So that's an example that's close to home that I'd say is consistent with what we're doing in Sacramento.
Thank you. Finally, Mr. Lynn, if you could just bring up page 134 of Exhibit 562. And basically, the peer review process by Professor Reynolds, Department of Biological Sciences, and Simon Fraser. And in the middle of the page there, he basically says that you've done the most comprehensive analysis and looked hard to support the freshwater habitat theory and does not find it. So I took that as an endorsement of your report and its conclusions. So thank you very much.
Mr. Commissioner, the next council is Mr. Harvey, but I would suggest we take the morning break now and then begin with Mr. Harvey, followed by Ms. Gartner after the break, if that's acceptable.
Hearing will now recess for 15 minutes.